At the bottom of South America, there are two ways from the Atlantic to the Pacific. One is Cape Horn, a wall of open ocean, where the seas run unbroken all the way around the planet, and where thousands of ships have been lost. The other cuts straight through the continent itself, a sheltered passage of narrow channels winding between the mainland and a maze of islands walled in on almost every side by land. Common sense says the sheltered route should be the safe one. For centuries, sailors believed the opposite. Many who reached the bottom of the world took one look at that narrow passage and chose to face the open ocean fury of Cape Horn instead. And they had their reasons. Because this sheltered corridor hemmed in by mountains and glaciers had ways of killing a ship that the open sea did not. This is the Strait of Magellan. It was the first route ever found around the bottom of the Americas, the passage that helped carry the first ships all the way around the world. And it earned every ounce of the fear that sailors held for it. This is the story of the man who forced his way through it, the colony it starved to death on its shores, and why 5 centuries later, the most dangerous shortcut in the world has still not let go. To understand the fear, it helps to understand the shape of the place. The Strait of Magellan is a long, twisting channel that separates the mainland of South America from Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire and the scattering of islands at the very tip of the continent. It runs for roughly 350 miles, connecting the Atlantic on one side to the Pacific on the other, threading between headlands, fjords, and mountains the entire way. All of it lies within the waters of Chile. It is also one of the remotest waterways on the planet, cutting through a wilderness of empty mountains and uninhabited islands that stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction, with no city, no safe harbor, and no help within reach for a ship in serious trouble. But its length is not what made it deadly. Its shape did. In places, the strait opens into wide, exposed reaches. In others, it pinches down into narrows barely a mile across tight gaps, where a great ship has almost no room to turn, and where the tide pours through like a river in flood. The channel bends and doubles back on itself so that the wind can strike from one direction, then another within a single passage. It is lined with rock. It is prone to thick fog. And it is cold in a way the tropics never prepare a crew for, with glaciers coming down almost to the water's edge. A ship in the open ocean, for all its danger, has one thing on its side: room. Room to run before a storm, room to ride out a wave, room to recover from a mistake. In the narrows of the Strait of Magellan, there is no room at all. And in these particular waters that mattered more than anywhere else on Earth because of the wind. The Strait of Magellan sits in the path of the same relentless westerly winds that terrorize Cape Horn and the Southern Ocean. But here, those winds do something worse. As the wind pours over the mountains and glaciers that wall in the strait, it can suddenly funnel down the slopes and slam onto the water below, without any warning at all. Sailors gave these sudden violent blasts a name of their own: willy-waws. A willy-waw can descend out of a clear sky, striking a vessel like a hammer, and driving it sideways in seconds. In the open ocean, a ship might have the sea room to absorb such a blow. In a channel a mile wide lined with rock, a single willy-waw at the wrong moment could put a ship on the shore before her crew had time to react. And the wind was only part of it. Through the tightest of the narrows, the tide could run so hard that a ship under sail might find herself pushed backward or swept toward the rocks no matter how her canvas was set. Currents met and clashed where the channels joined. Uncharted reefs waited just beneath the surface. And for days at a time, thick fog could settle over the whole passage, hiding the shoreline and the shoals and the branching channels until a captain was navigating a maze of stone, half blind. For a sailing ship, this was close to a nightmare. Square-rigged vessels needed steady wind and open water to work. They could not easily fight their way against sudden gusts in a tight, twisting channel. A ship could spend days trapped in the strait, unable to make headway against the wind, anchored in freezing water, waiting for a break that might never come, all while the willy-waws hunted for a mistake. That is why so many captains in the age of sail, when they reached the choice, turned away from the sheltered passage and took their chances with the open ocean storms of Cape Horn instead. The strait was shorter. The strait was protected from the great swells. And still they feared it more, because the open ocean gave a ship a fighting chance, and the narrows did not. The first fleet ever to enter this passage had no idea what waited inside. There were no charts. There was no name for it. There was only a commander who believed a way through the continent existed, and who was prepared to lose everything to prove it. In 1519, a Portuguese navigator named Ferdinand Magellan set out from Spain with 5 ships and more than 250 men searching for a western sea route to the riches of the Spice Islands. The maps of the day showed no way through the American continent. Magellan was gambling his expedition and his life on the belief that one existed somewhere in the far south. The voyage nearly destroyed itself before it ever reached the strait. Wintering on the bleak Patagonian coast, with the cold biting and supplies running low, several of his Spanish captains turned against their Portuguese commander and rose in mutiny. Magellan put it down. Without mercy, the rebellion was crushed, and its leaders were executed or left behind. He had held his fleet together, but the cost in trust and blood was heavy, and the worst still lay ahead. Then late in 1520, the fleet found it, an opening in the coast that led not to a dead-end bay, but onward deeper into the land's salt water, all the way. Magellan turned his ships into the unknown channel and began to feel his way through. It took 38 days. 38 days of picking through fog and narrows, of anchoring against sudden winds, of sending boats ahead to find which of the branching channels led onward and which ended against a wall of rock. Every branch was a gamble. The strait did not run in a single clean line, but split again and again into dead-end sounds and false passages, and a wrong choice could cost days the fleet could not spare. The crews were cold frightened and increasingly certain their commander was leading them to their deaths in a maze with no way out. During the ordeal, one of his ships was wrecked while scouting the coast. Another, loaded with a large share of the fleet's provisions, turned back in secret and deserted sailing for home, and abandoning the expedition entirely. Magellan pressed on with what remained. Along the way, he gave the region the names it still carries. The land to the south, dotted at night with the fires of its native people, he called Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. And when the battered fleet at last emerged from the far end of the channel into open water and found it calm after everything they had endured, Magellan named that ocean the Pacific, the Peaceful Sea. He had done what no one had done before. He had found a way through the bottom of the world. But the strait was only the first trial. The sea he had just named would test the survivors far beyond anything the passage had done. What followed the strait was a catastrophe. The Pacific proved vaster than anyone had imagined. The fleet crossed it slowly, running out of food and fresh water, the men dying of starvation and scurvy in the endless empty ocean. And when they finally reached the islands of the Philippines, Magellan himself was killed, drawn into a local conflict and cut down in the shallows far from home, with the circumnavigation he had begun still unfinished. The man who had forced the passage through the bottom of the Americas never saw the end of the voyage he had started. The expedition staggered on without him. Of the 5 ships and the more than 250 men who had set out from Spain, only a single ship completed the journey all the way around the world and returned home. Aboard her were roughly 18 survivors, a handful of starving, exhausted men, all that remained of the fleet that had sailed south 3 years earlier. She carried a hold of spices that against all odds still turned a profit for the expedition's backers. But the true cost had been paid in lives. Almost everyone who set out was dead. It was one of the greatest voyages in history and one of the deadliest. And at the heart of it, the point where the whole undertaking had nearly come apart, was the strait, the passage that would carry Magellan's name for the rest of time, precisely because so few who followed him would find it any kinder. The strait did not only kill ships, it killed those who tried to live beside it. Later in the same century, Spain decided that whoever controlled the Strait of Magellan controlled the only known door between the 2 great oceans. To hold it, they sent an expedition to plant settlements directly on its shores, garrisoned by colonists who would guard the passage against rival powers. The plan collided with the reality of the place. The settlements were founded on a coast that was brutally cold, cut off from resupply, and surrounded by land that could not feed them. Winter came, and the promised support did not. The colonists began to starve. Cut off at the bottom of the world, they died slowly through the dark months of hunger, of cold, of despair, in a place that had looked on a map in Europe like the key to an empire. When an English ship put into the strait a few years later, its crew came upon what was left, a settlement of the dead and the dying, its last survivors barely clinging to life among the bodies of those who had already gone. The English took the few they could and sailed on, and they gave the place a name that told the whole story in 2 words: Port Famine. It stands as one of the grimmest lessons the strait ever taught. The passage was lethal to the ships that crossed it. Its shores were lethal to the people who tried to hold it. For all of Europe's ambition, the bottom of the world would not be tamed by planting a flag on it. There is a bitter irony buried in the story of port famine. The colonists starved on a coast they were sure could not support human life. And yet, all around them, it already did. For thousands of years, before any Europeans saw the strait, people had lived in these channels. Among them were the canoe people's nomadic families who moved through the fjords in small bark boats hunting seals and gathering shellfish, and keeping fires burning almost constantly for warmth, even aboard their canoes on the water. It was those fires glimpsed at night along the shore that had given Tierra del Fuego its name in the first place. In one of the coldest, harshest environments on the planet, they had built a way of life that endured generation after generation in the exact place where a European colony had wasted away in a single winter. Their knowledge could not protect them from what came next. As outsiders arrived in greater numbers bringing diseases the local peoples had never encountered, and later, the guns and fences of the sheep ranches that spread across the land, these communities were devastated, their populations collapsing within a few generations. The strait that had sustained them for millennia would outlast them too. And yet in time, people did learn to live beside the strait, and for a while, it made them prosperous. In the middle of the 19th century, a settlement was founded on the northern shore of the passage. In time, it would grow into the city of Punta Arenas, and its fortunes were tied directly to a change out at sea, the coming of steam. Steamships, unlike sailing vessels, could power straight through the Narrows, driving against the very winds that had trapped sail for centuries. For them, the sheltered strait was no longer a trap. It was the smart choice, shorter and calmer than the open ocean gauntlet of Cape Horn. Suddenly, the Strait of Magellan was one of the great highways of world shipping. Vessels bound between the Atlantic and the Pacific funneled through it, stopping at Punta Arenas to take on coal and supplies. The city on the edge of the world grew rich as the gateway between two oceans in the golden age of the steamship. The boom drew people from across the globe to this remote corner of Patagonia. Beyond the coaling trade, the surrounding grasslands filled with vast sheep ranches, and for a few decades, wool made fortunes at the bottom of the continent. Grand houses rose in a city that only a lifetime before had been one of the loneliest outposts on Earth. Then, in 1914, that age ended in a single stroke. The Panama Canal opened far to the north, cutting a path between the oceans through the narrow waste of Central America. Overnight, there was no longer any need to sail to the bottom of the continent at all. The traffic drained away from the strait just as it drained away from Cape Horn, and the passage that had carried the first ships around the world slipped into the quiet of history. But the sea has a way of refusing to stay settled. In recent years, the very canal that made the southern routes obsolete has shown just how fragile a shortcut can be. A severe drought struck the Panama Canal, lowering the freshwater lakes that fill its locks and forcing it to cut the number of ships it could pass from around 36 or more each day down to as few as 18 at the worst of it, before the water levels slowly recovered. The disruption pushed much of the world's shipping onto longer routes once again, and even now, the canal's reliability rides on the reins with the threat of renewed drought never far away. The Strait of Magellan has not filled with traffic the way it once did, but it has never truly closed. Ships still move through it. Regional vessels research ships, and the growing fleet of expedition and cruise vessels that use Punta Arenas as a gateway to Antarctica farther south than almost anywhere else people travel. They pass through waters still ruled by the same willywaws, the same narrows, the same cold, requiring the same caution, and very often a local pilot who knows exactly where the wind comes down off the mountains. Even now, with modern engines and satellite navigation, the strait demands respect. Vessels still run aground on its rocks. Sudden squalls still catch crews unprepared, and the glaciers that wall it in are among the fastest retreating on Earth, slowly reshaping the very shoreline that Magellan's fleet once crept along. It remains as it has always been, a place that does not forgive carelessness. The strait was never conquered. It was only for a time avoided, and the moment the shortcut faltered, the old passages at the bottom of the world were waiting exactly as they always have been. 500 years after Ferdinand Magellan felt his way through it, the strait that bears his name is almost unchanged. The Narrows are still there, barely a mile across, with the tide still racing through them. The glaciers still come down to the water, and the wind still gathers over the mountains and falls without warning onto the channel below, exactly as it did on the day the first fleet crept in, not knowing whether the passage led anywhere at all. Magellan found a way through the bottom of the world, and it cost him his fleet, his men, and in the end, his life, though he never lived to learn that the voyage had succeeded. The colonists who came after him to hold his strait starved to death on its shores. The sailors who came after them feared it so deeply that many chose the open ocean horror of Cape Horn instead. And the age of steam that finally mastered it lasted barely half a century before a canal made it all unnecessary. The passage endured every bit of it. It is still there tonight, dark and narrow and cold, at the very edge of the map, a shortcut through the bottom of the world that has never once pretended to be safe. That is the strange power of the place. It was never the widest water, nor the stormiest. It was simply the most unforgiving of a mistake, a corridor of rock and wind and ice where there was never quite enough room to be wrong. More of the world's deadliest waters and the ships they kept in the films that follow. The next lies at the opposite end of the Americas, a frozen maze at the top of the world that swallowed entire expeditions whole and kept its secrets locked in the ice for more than a century. The Northwest Passage.